Good afternoon, Mr Greer.
Good
I think
afternoon.
we're ready to resume. Mr McGregor.
Thank you, Mark. Mr Greer, before lunch we were looking at the approach to the assessment of tenders. And I just want to ask you a couple more questions about that before we move on. What I'm really interested in is the approach that would be taken to the assessment of tenders. I appreciate from what you've said you weren't involved in the minutiae of the actual assessment itself. That would have been for others. But if we could look within the board's construction requirements, please. So bundle 2, page 839. So this is within the board's construction requirements, which were going to be assessed on a pass or a fail basis. If we could look to the subsection 5.2 at the bottom, infection prevention and control, and look to the second paragraph there, which says Project Co shall ensure all aspects of the facilities allow for the control and management of any outbreak and or spread of infectious diseases in accordance with the following, and then there's various guidance. And if we look over the page onto page 840, at letter F, there's mentioned ventilation and healthcare premises, SHTM 0301. It's really just in terms of the approach. If a bidder's being told that they have to show that they're going to manage an outbreak of infection in accordance with SHTM 0301, how would the assessment team work out if a bidder was doing that in a satisfactory manner, or is that level of assessment simply not taking place when the bids come in?
Yeah, I don't think that level of assessment would take place during the procurement phase of the project.
And is that essentially for the reasons that you've given previously about your views in terms of where risks sat and the volume of work that would be required to analyse that level of detail?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. The next issue, and it's still really still in the same area, but there was a requirement within the board construction requirements to comply with Chief Executive Letter 19 of 2010, and you touch upon that in your statement. At that point in time, whenever you were working on the project, did you have an appreciation of Chief Executive Letter 19 of 2010?
I think I was generally aware of it, but I wouldn't have known the details of it at the time.
Because again, I asked Mr McRae about that issue, whether Cell 19 2010 was on his radar, and he said, look, that's not something that would have been on my radar. So what I would be interested in is, in terms of the Mott MacDonald team, who, if anyone, would have had the requirements of Cell 19 2010 on their radar?
In terms of the evaluation side of things, I don't think it would have been at that level of detail. I would imagine, so I wasn't involved in the drafting, but generally when as I mentioned, I was working on Aberdeen Healthcare Village, and we drafted some, it was authority construction requirements there. So that was probably one of the templates they used to start the drafting of the board's construction requirements for here. So in terms of how that would develop, the technical advisor team would start a draft of the board's construction requirements. It would be sent out generally to the NHS Loading Estates team to comment on, and broader consultation. So that so whether that clause was in the healthcare village version of it, and it's been carried on, I'm not sure, or whether it was specifically included for this project. I'm not sure exactly how that developed.
Yes, and at some point subsequently, perhaps in preparing for the inquiry, have you had an opportunity to look at Cell 19 2010 and its requirements?
Yes.
I can turn up the references if you want, but certainly my understanding, and the inquiry's looked at it a couple of times, is that Cell 19 2010 made it a mandatory requirement for the activity database or an equivalent to be used as a design and briefing tool. And I think the reason that I flag it to you at this stage is whether there was any assessment being made when the tenders are being assessed as to whether bidders had used the activity database as a design tool?
I don't think so. There was part of the submission was to have some of the room data sheets in the draft final tenders and the final tender. And generally, if you're producing room data sheets, you would use the template ADBs as your starting point to produce that. So in a roundabout way, it could have been, but it would have been up to the bidders to decide how they were going to generate those room data sheets.
Because I think within your statement you say you had assumed that that's how a bidder would have produced the room data sheets that they submitted. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think just it was based on the format of the draft final tender. It had the ADB codes on it, and it looked a similar format as to if you'd started with a template ADB.
But that wouldn't have been your job to review the technical information in there because you're not a mechanical engineer.
No.
Mr McRae gave evidence and he said that he wasn't actually aware that room data sheets had been produced in the period to financial close. Does that surprise you?
No, not. I suspect Colin probably wasn't aware of them. The room data sheets. So when we got into the preferred bidder phase, it was one of the first items we identified as a priority item to develop. Now it was early April 14 where that was identified. I think when the first draft of the room data sheets came out, I think it was about 8 weeks out from the projected financial close date. So I think there was a series of meetings took place. First of all, there was a question raised by NHS Lothian as to whether NHS Lothian was willing to accept a reduced amount of room data sheets. And then beyond that point, all the discussions were around mitigation measures to make sure that we got fully populated room data sheets in the construction phase. So I think in terms of Colin not being aware of that, it's probably because they weren't reviewed in the build-up. There was a decision taken to go for mitigation measures as opposed to a review.
But am I right in thinking in terms of both the ITPD and the ISFT, there were two stages to the production of room data sheets. So with the bid, there had to be key and generic rooms that were produced, and then 100% room data sheets for the hospital had to be produced by financial close.
Yes, that's right.
So in terms of the key and generic rooms, the room data sheets for those spaces, are you aware of anyone from Mott MacDonald reviewing those at the tender assessment stage?
I'm sorry, I'm not aware.
Okay. The only reason I raise it is, appreciate you're not a mechanical engineer, it's more in terms of the process of how a pass or a fail would have worked. But the spaces, the key and generic rooms included critical care rooms. And it might seem surprising that Mr McRae hadn't reviewed those key and generic rooms at the tender assessment stage. Do you have any observations on that?
I think it was probably back down to the quantity of information they had to get through and the time available to do it. So I would imagine, I'm not sure exactly where the room data sheets were submitted in. I would imagine it would probably be in one of the appendices to the architectural submission as opposed to a mechanical electrical submission. So I think it probably would have been led by the architectural team reviews. And again, that would be sufficient to develop the comments and the consensus, or consensus comments, and then a score. I'd imagine that it's the architecture teams. It was one of many drawings they would have been looking at, and probably wasn't a huge focus on it from an architectural perspective.
What's the point of asking tenderers to produce room data sheets for key and generic rooms if they're not going to be reviewed when their tenders are being assessed?
Ultimately, so you've got fully populated room data sheets for the contract at financial close.
Mr McRae in his evidence said that he thought if he'd been provided with the room data sheets that there's a possibility for the critical care rooms that he might have spotted what I think NHS Lothian now accepts were errors in the environmental matrix. Would you share that view?
It's a possibility, yeah.
Do you think it'd be fair to say that that's possibly a missed opportunity if those RUMA data sheets weren't reviewed by a mechanical engineer at the tender assessment stage?
I think it goes back to the contract risk allocation. That it could have been picked up in the reviews, but it wasn't the NHS Lothian or Mott MacDonald's responsibility to make sure they were fully compliant. But yes, so it could have been picked up in the reviews.
Because I think in your statement you say it could have been picked up, but that's not to mean it should have been picked up. Again, other people may look at it and say, well, Mott MacDonald are there as the lead technical advisor. Should they not be spotting such issues at the tender assessment stage?
I think if our role was to do a detailed design audit, then yeah, I think that's the type of thing we should be picking up. But as I say, it was a sample review. They had a few hours per question with significant information to get through. Then I don't think that it's not the type of thing I would expect to be picked up.
So for a £150 million hospital project for sick children, you wouldn't be expecting room data sheets for critical care rooms to be reviewed at the tender assessment stage?
No.
If I can ask you some questions about bidder C, and again, I'll keep these at the level of, I'm interested in your views as the person who's project managing it, as opposed to the individual that's doing the detailed technical assessment. One of the issues that you address in your statement is whether the tender that comes in from bidder C should have had alarm bells ringing within Mott MacDonald. So my understanding is that there's the tender that comes in from IHSL, which says we'll comply with published guidance, including SHTM 0301, and we will comply with the environmental matrix. We don't need to make any changes to it whatsoever. Bidder C's tender says we will comply with published guidance, including SHTM 0301, but we need to change the values in the environmental matrix, and they mark them up in red. Why is that not an alarm bell that should be ringing at Mott MacDonald at that point?
I think it's back to the level of detail that was reviewed at that point in time. I say I didn't do the reviews myself, but I can imagine the guys having a limited time to review the submissions, and therefore that type of thing I wouldn't expect to be picked up. The purpose of the evaluation is to generate comments in order to ultimately agree a consensus score. It's not the purpose is not to do a detailed check on the bidder's design, and back to the risk allocation of the contract. It's up to the bidders to make sure it's a fully compliant solution.
But even just at that very high level, one bidder saying, I can comply with the guidance and I don't need to change the matrix, and another saying, I can comply with the guidance, but I do need to change the matrix. Does it not follow that one of those bids must be a variant bid?
I don't think, I'm not a mechanical engineer, but my understanding is that depending on the architectural layout and the particular design, then the environmental matrix would have to be updated to reflect that particular design. So it could have been, or it's likely that bidder C would have a different architectural solution to bidder B, and therefore the matrix would have been different.
Thank you.
Sorry, my fault entirely, Mr. Greer. Your question was surely one of these bids must have been non-compliant, or did I mishear?
Indeed, I asked whether, I think simply as a matter of logic, whether one of the bids must have been a variant bid that should have been rejected. And as I understand it, Mr Greer's response was to say he didn't accept that was a binary choice because there could be different architectural and technical solutions put forward by various bidders.
Thank you.
If I could move on and look at the tender assessment itself, if we could look to bundle 8, please, and to page 92. Bundle 8, page 92, which should be IHSL's ITPD evaluation pro forma for the C8 section. So we see the reviewer's comments, and if we look in the first box, so this is for C8, clarity, robustness and quality of M&E engineering design proposals. The reviewer's comment is lacking detail on design philosophy and BCR compliance. But is the brief achieved? Yes. Again, can you assist with how a tender could be lacking detail on design philosophy and BCR compliance, but be assessed as being satisfactory and a pass?
I think it was back to what's sufficient from a procurement perspective. I take it the reviewers felt that there was sufficient detail, although it did lack detail. There was sufficient information to still achieve the pass marks.
And if we look over the page to page 93, please, you'll see Roman numeral 10, approximately 4 boxes up from the bottom. So Roman numeral 10, an environmental conditions stroke room provisions matrix for both mechanical and electrical services for each room in the facilities. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then we see the reviewer's comments, no matrix provide, but environmental layout drawings provide. And then if we look onto the next box, major plant life cycle statements and design life, including an explanation of the bidder's lifestyle philosophy to support the lifestyle, analysis completed by the technical pro forma costs, basic statement referring to SIBSI guidance for life cycles, no cost provided. And then after that, we see C8.3. Whilst bidders are required to undertake their own design, the board has provided a draft environmental matrix as part of the ITPD documentation. Bidders must confirm acceptance of the board's environmental matrix, highlighting any proposed changes on an exception basis. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the response given is good response. Do you know why that response was given?
So I don't remember the detail of it. So I didn't do the valuation myself, but I would imagine they'd be thinking that the bidder has agreed to develop their own design and the preferred bidder to financial close. But I think bidder A did a similar response. They said they accepted the draft, but they'll develop it further. And then bidder C, they went a step further and started to develop it. Yeah. So I think overall, my recollection it was just a satisfactory response. The overall score. So I think they got a score of 5, which was the lowest of the tenders, which kind of reflected as you said earlier, it was limited detail. So I think that was ultimately the overall comments were then reflected in the lowest score.
The reason I raise this with you is it's certainly NHS Lothian's position before the inquiry that the environmental matrix had issues in terms of compliance with published guidance, including SHTM 0301 for critical care rooms. Against that background, do you find it surprising that the technical team that assessed it thought that this was a good response? Or again, does this come back to the issues that you've told us about before, about the level and intensity of review that's being undertaken at this stage?
Yeah, it's back to that point about level of review.
If we could move on to a new issue, and it's an issue about stamped drawings, which you touch on in your statement. If we could look to your statement, please. So it's bundle 13. And if we'd start on page 147 at paragraph 53, please. Paragraph 53 at the bottom, you state the lengthy conversation about the document stamp related to design risk allocation. I worked with McRoberts on this as it was critical to the operational functionality risk in the contract to ensure that any signing of the submitted design was limited to the operational functionality aspects of the project. This reflected the risk allocation in the project agreement. NHS Lothian was only accepting design risk for aspects of the project relevant to operational functionality. By stamping drawings as approved, there was a risk NHS Lothian could be deemed to be taking responsibility for the design. And it was only appropriate for them to be doing that for matters relevant to operational functionality. This matter was discussed by all parties and I believe understood by all of them at the time. Could you just, if we begin by thinking about what do you mean by the stamping of the drawings? What stage is that taking place at?
So I think this occurred in the PBS. I think we started to do a informal review procedure before financial close. I'm not sure, I can't recall if the stamp was for pre or post financial close. But the principle of it was that, as I say, I was recommending that the board didn't just say a drawing was approved just on the basis that that didn't fit with the contract risk allocation. So we wanted to make it sure that if anyone was stamping a drawing as level A or level B, which is allowing the project to proceed, then that was only in so far as it related to operational functionality, which is back to that limited definition of 1 to 500 layouts, 1 to 200 and 1 to 50 layouts.
So as the drawings are being developed, you've got a reticence about stamping them in case it could be seen that the board was effectively taking responsibility for them. And you tell us within your statement that as far as you can recollect, everyone was clear on that because you were telling IHSL that's why you weren't stamping the document.
Yeah, there was a very lengthy email trail on it, which was discussed a lot.
Thank you. Before I move on to the period between preferred bidder and financial close, there's one other issue that I'd want to pick up, perhaps on the technical side, and it relates to room data sheets and the activity database. So if you've looked at Cell 19 2010, you'll see that it's mandatory for NHS bodies to use the activity database as a design and briefing tool or to use an equivalent. The inquiry's heard evidence from a number of people that have said they have some concerns about the activity database and how robust the information is within it, whether it's always up to date, whether it's accurate, and whether it would always reflect the Scottish Health Technical Memoranda. Now, you touched on those issues in your statement, but can you just explain to the inquiry any concerns you would have about the activity database and how robust the information within it is?
I think it's that knowledge, I think, has come latterly as opposed to probably what I knew at the time. Certainly, I think it's widely known that certainly the environmental characteristics in the templates ADB sheets need reviewed.
And why would that be? Why would they need to be reviewed? Why couldn't you just produce your room data sheet and take it as read that would have all the right environmental parameters?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a clause 2.60 in the SHTM, so it's in SHTM 0301, which directs you to the ADB sheets for the specific characteristics for the room. There's a slight contradiction in that. The SHTM is telling you to go to the ADB sheets for your ventilation requirements, but there's now a known. I'm not sure if that was known at the time that there was anomalies with the data in the ADB sheets, but it's something certainly we're well aware of now.
So again, probably not known about at the time, but if we just think, say you were working on a project of this nature now for a different hospital facility, and someone simply said we're going to use room data sheets produced with the ADB system, would you have concerns about that if there wasn't going to be a detailed review of those room data sheets?
Yes, yeah.
And just, it may be obvious, but why?
Yeah, so that I think there's known issues with the environmental characteristics in the ADB sheets, so that there needs to be a robust methodology now for developing. You use your template ADBs as a starting point, and then you develop it in consultation with various stakeholders.
I think one expert that gave evidence in the inquiry described room data sheets produced using the ADB system as a starter for 10. Is that how they're viewed within the industry?
I think they are now, yeah.
Thank you. I now want to move on and think about the period from preferred bidder to financial close. How much work in terms of volume of work needed to be done in the period from IHSL being appointed as preferred bidder until financial close was achieved?
Sorry, could you say the question again?
What volume of work had to be done in the period from preferred bidder to reach financial close?
Yeah, there was significant work. One of the primary objectives was developing the bidders' proposals and turning them into project co-proposals. There was a substantial amount of work in that. There was also developing the service level spec documentation again. So there was the FM documents had bidders' proposals, and then they had to be turned into contract documents. So, yeah, there was a lot, and then there's the whole commercial development as well.
And in terms of the development of the project co-proposals, how did that go? Was there a clear understanding between the parties as to what had to be achieved, or were there difficulties in the project co-proposals being produced?
Yeah, there was difficulties. It was fair. I think IHSL's view at the start was just to use the board's construction requirement clauses rather than use the bidder's proposals. So there was a bit of confusion there at the start to say we need to develop the bidder's proposals into project co-proposals and not just rely on the board's construction requirements. So it took a while to develop that, and then we also then had to try and develop a structure to what the project co-proposals were going to look like, and again that took a bit of time. And then agreed a programme for development of the project co-proposals, and I think the first iteration, I think we were due. It was about 32 project co-proposals, I think, that were due, and we only got 15, but they were largely just a copy of the bid proposals. So it took a lot longer than we'd have liked.
Some witnesses that have given evidence to the inquiry have said that there was a mismatch in expectations between NHSL and Malt MacDonald as opposed to IHSL in terms of what had to be provided and the level of detail that had to be provided. Would you agree with that?
I think there was our primary objective was trying to get them to a base. Or the first objective was to get them to a base level. The bidders' submissions quite often have options in them, and there's a lot of photos and things like that which are good from a bid perspective, but it's not what you want in the contract. So it took longer in terms of whether there was a mismatch. I think latterly, I do recall discussions or second-hand discussions probably about October or so when they were saying we were asking for too much information. From our perspective, we were really trying to push to get what we thought was the base level to get to suitable for inclusion in the contract.
The reason I raise it is, again, a layman looking in might find it surprising if there's been an open and fair competition with board construction requirements being issued to all bidders during an open procurement exercise, that there was a mismatch in expectations. Was it not obvious from the published documentation what the bidder had to do?
Yeah, typically the preferred bidder or the hubco, the company leading the technical design, they would typically drive the project co-proposals and get to refine proposals so they knew that when they hit financial close, they could then hit the ground running in the construction phase.
Because if we just take one example, it was stated within both the ITPD and the ISFT that the successful party would have to produce 100% room data sheets for every space in the hostel by financial close. Was that achieved by IHSL?
No.
Why not?
We identified it early as a priority item. I think it was, early April when we did that. I think it took to about August until we'd had a template. And then, it was October or so until we got a first draft, by which point it was too late. So in terms of why it took so long, IHSL probably better placed to comment on what there was a lot going. There is a lot going on in the preferred bidder to financial close period. So I can understand there was a lot of development in the 1 to 500s, the 1 to 200s, the 1 to 50s, the whole architect. So there's an awful lot going on. So I can understand why it might not have been a priority for IHSL, but it was a requirement.
And in terms of it being a requirement, again, the inquiry's heard evidence that it wasn't a requirement that was insisted upon by NHS Lothian. Do you know why NHS Lothian didn't insist upon that requirement that had been set out in the published procurement documents?
I think there was a compromise made to try and reach financial close.
And in terms of that compromise, how was it compromised? Was it simply waived, or was it put into reviewable design data? What happened?
We enhanced there were some extra clauses added to the board's construction requirements, and there was extra clauses added to the completion criteria to make sure that there was compliant room data sheets produced in the construction phase.
Just thinking about that requirement that there should have been 100% room data sheets by financial close, if that had happened, would the environmental matrix effectively have been redundant by that point if you had a full suite of room data sheets?
I'm not sure it would have been redundant. I think it would still have been a useful exercise, I think, from probably a mechanical and electrical design perspective. I think, yeah, the shift would have moved to using the room data sheets as the primary source, but I'd imagine there might still have been benefits from a design perspective.
Okay. And again, the inquiry understands that the environmental matrix, or at least certain parts of the environmental matrix, became reviewable design data within the ultimate contract. Do you know why that happened?
Again, it took longer. I think the environmental matrix, yeah, either the environmental matrix or the room data sheets would still have been reviewable design data. So that I think, and there was a template list of RDD that was shared in the procurement documents. I'm sure that would have contained room data sheets. I think there would always have been the expectation that would have happened in the construction phase.
The reason I raise it is the inquiry heard evidence from an individual from Wallace Whittle TUV Sud, and he commented on the fact that the environmental matrix was included as reviewable design data, and he said from a designer's point of view he had never seen that done before, and he thought it would be commercially dangerous because the individual that had to design it and price it wouldn't know what they were designing or how they would price the system. Do you have any observations on that?
It was the concept of having it as reviewable design data was discussed in the MEP work stream, and I think Wallace Whittle were included in that. So the idea of it being reviewable design data was well discussed in the prior to financial close.
Thank you. And just to pick up one other issue, I think this morning you referred to the ITPD having the environmental matrix as an appendix to the board's construction requirements, but by financial close it had been moved into a separate part of the contract, into the schedule part 6 of the project agreement. From your perspective, was there any significance to that change?
It was putting it where, from a contract perspective, that was appropriate to put it, because the room data sheets is where the environmental characteristics sit, and so it made sense. I think it was discussed that with McRoberts when we were deciding where best to put it.
Thank you. If I could ask you to have your statement in front of you again, please, but bundle 13, page 155. Paragraph 75, and if we could just perhaps pick matters up at the very end of what's on page 155 over the page onto page 156. It's the final line. You state IHSL did adopt the environmental matrix and developed it. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you say making some significant changes to it. Again, I appreciate it's a long time ago, but you've said that when they took it on and developed it, they made some significant changes. Can you just give us an example or a couple of examples of the significant changes that were made?
There was the changes to Guidance Note 15. I felt was a significant change. That was, so I'm not sure if we discussed this earlier, it was the RFI 005 was issued by IHSL requesting that Guidance Note 15 relates to critical care areas, and IHSL were asking if humidification was a requirement for the air handling units in the critical care areas. So that the RFI came in, it was issued, the project management team issued it to the technical and the clinical teams. There was a paper produced on whether it was required or not, and then the response went back to IHSL, and the response went back saying NHS Lothian don't require humidification in the handling units. They require the space for future provision. So that change was then made to the Guidance Note 15 of the environmental matrix and on Project Co's environmental matrix. So I thought that was a significant change for the ventilation requirements in the critical care area. I mean, there was the whole format of the sheet was changed. As I mentioned earlier, the logo was taken off. I think there was additional guidance notes added. I'm not sure the detail of them. Just remember some extra notes being added to the guidance notes, and there was generally changes. I don't know the detail of the changes that were made, but I'm aware that there was from the technical team there was changes to the content of the matrix as well, the main content.
Thank you. I'd now like to move on. We're still within the period up to financial close, and if we could go back and look at some of the comments that were made on NHS Lothian's behalf at that time. If we could look to bundle 4, please, page 218. This is the document we've looked at before, that the comments that were being made on the 13th of October 2014. And if we look over the page, please, onto page 219. You see at the top of the page, there's a comment: further review and development of the environmental matrix is required to clarify the following. And it says there are some rooms at 28 degrees which are provided with comfort cooling. There are areas or rooms in the environmental matrix that contradict the above BCR clause. Hence, once IHSL produce an updated environmental matrix, further discussion is required with the board to confirm which rooms or areas are not going to meet the clause. And then you see that the next section is comment 7. It says bedrooms 4 air changes per hour. SHTM says 6 air changes an hour. Bedrooms of no extract, etc. In terms of that comment 7, can you remember why that was being highlighted? The bedrooms at 4 air changes an hour. SHTM saying 6.
I think it was Colin McRae in his reviews of the designs had noted that the bedrooms didn't seem to comply with SHTM 0301. So that was a comment that was flagged to IHSL. And
do you know if that issue was resolved?
No, it wasn't. There was further discussions beyond that relating to this.
Did there emerge issues in terms of single bed rooms, in terms of both air change rates and pressure regimes?
Yeah, so I mean the conversation went. So, do you have a date on this one? This was.
So these are the comments from October 2014.
Yeah, so there was a subsequent meeting. I think it was the 11th of November, where there was a refined set of comments produced. It took out the detail on the air handling units, but just asked for detailed proposals weighted on the ventilation requirements to meet the negative or balanced pressure. So the day after that, Colin then sent me another email saying, still concerned about this. So it was sent to Willie and myself, and it was then raised again at the High Screen meeting, which was a week or so after that. And then the conversation then continued into January, where Wallace Whittle produced a airflow diagram. January, that was then, I think it was an RFI 77 then followed that. And the RFI was then discussed. Again, it went to the project management team. Project management team put it out to the clinical and the technical, and then a response went back asking that the design complied with SHTM 0301 and shouldn't in any way rely on opening windows.
Thank you. So again, maybe just to pick up some of that chronology that you've mentioned, if we look within bundle 4 to page 245, you see an email of the 11th of November from Graeme Greer to the various people, and you're saying, "Dear all, notes attached from today's meeting." Is that what you're referring to, the meeting of the 11th of November?
Yes, yes.
Then if we look at a couple of pages on to page 247, you see a note beginning, "Project Co shall update the environmental matrix to reflect the following board comments." Do you see that?
Yes.
Is this what you're talking about in terms of the note that you made that perhaps stripped back what we saw in the more detailed comment from October 2014?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
And if we look 4 bullet points up from the bottom, do you see an entry, detailed proposal?
Yeah.
Detailed proposal awaited on bedroom ventilation to achieve balanced stroke negative pressure related to corridor. And I think you told us that the discussions continued, that there was a proposal that came back from Wallace Whittle TUV Sud. And is my recollection right that Mr McRae didn't agree that the proposal that came back addressed the concerns that he had?
Yeah, the one that came in January, it wasn't just Colin, that was discussed more broadly with the infection control team and the NHS Lothian team. And I'd say there was the response went back that that wasn't acceptable and it had to comply with SHTM 0301.
Just in relation to this chronology, if I could ask you to have bundle 8, please, page 69. So that should be an email from you to Brian Curry dated the 13th of November 2014. Do you see that?
Yep.
To which say, "Brian, further to the environmental matrix meeting on Monday, please refer to the email below and attached that summarises the issue with the single bed ventilation. As discussed at the environmental matrix meeting, we added the following comment to the environmental matrix: detailed proposal awaited on bedroom ventilation to achieve balanced stroke negative pressure relative to corridor." Do you see that?
Yes.
If we look on to page 70 within that chain, you'll see an email from Colin McRae to William Stevenson, which you're copied into. Do you see that?
Yes, yeah.
Where he says, "Attached is a summary of Project Co current ventilation strategy for a single bedroom. Could I get your comments, please?" Do you see that?
Yes. Yeah.
And then if we look over, we see the comments that had been made on page 71. This is Mr McRae's views on the single bed ventilation. And just below the table, do you see wording beginning Mott MacDonald?
Yes.
It says, "Mott MacDonald concerns is that the room will be at a slight positive pressure relative to the corridor, which would allow infections such as MRSA or norovirus to spread." Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, just to make sure that I'm understanding this, we're in a period now of November 2014, financial close takes place a couple of months later in February of 2015, is that correct?
Yes.
And in terms of the proposals that are being put forward by IHSL, there's a concern on Mr McRae's part, shared by others at Mott MacDonald, that the ventilation system that's being proposed by IHSL would allow the spread of infections, including MRSA and norovirus. Is that right?
Yes.
Like at this point, given that we're talking about a children's hospital, how concerned were yourself and Mr McRae about what was being proposed by IHSL?
It was one of many issues I think we were working through at that point. So it wasn't something which jumped out as being a higher priority than anything else that we were working on to get to financial close. But it was something we wanted to address before financial close and the subsequent meetings from that.
The reason I raise this is we think back to the board construction requirements, so what the board said to the market it wanted to achieve. One of the critical requirements set out within the board construction requirements was that infection prevention and control, spread of any infection would be controlled in line with Scottish Health Technical Memorandum 0301. Given that the board had said that they wanted a bidder to do that right from the outset, were you concerned by November 2014 that IHSL's solution would give rise to a risk of a spread of MRSA or norovirus?
Yes, yeah, generally concerned. I think I said there was a lot going on at that point, so it was one of many issues we were working through at the point. But there wasn't any. I guess the reason I'm caveating response is there wasn't any indication that there wasn't any indication at that point that IHSL weren't on, when we got to financial close into the construction phase, going to make it compliant with SHTM 0301. I think if we'd got to the point before financial close, if IHSL had said, no, we're not going to comply with SHTM 0301, I think that would have been alarm bells ringing, and yeah, we would have to have escalated further. But at the time, we were all working collaboratively together to get financial close, and the expectation was they were going to make it compliant. So
again, so I'm understanding your position was this was an issue to be managed, but it wasn't something that was ringing alarm bells on the part of Mock MacDonald.
It was a concern, but it was something we were working through. Yeah.
And what about the board's perspective? Because obviously you're copying in people from NHS Lothian, such as Brian Curry. What was their reaction to the idea that the design development at this point, late 2014, had a risk of a spread of MRSA or norovirus within a children's hospital?
I said that generally what I would do is if there was an issue I felt was needing escalated, then yeah, Brian would generally be the port of call. So yeah, so I passed this email on. I think Brian, not sure exactly, but there was a point in time where we flagged the ventilation issues as an escalation issue to Brian, and then Brian escalated it into the design steering group meeting as a point for discussion there. So I think that they did address it, and again, it was back to that point. If there'd been an indication that IHSL weren't going to comply, then obviously I think there would have been more significant concerns.
But just in terms of that issue of whether IHSL were going to comply, certainly from Mr McRae's evidence, my understanding is that there was almost a bit of a standoff at this point whereby Mr McRae had said, I don't think your technical solution complies with published guidance. I think it gives rise to these risks of a spread of MRSA or norovirus. Wallace Whittle, TUV Sud, came back and said, we don't agree with you, and gave an explanation as to why they disagreed. Mr McRae considered that and said that he didn't accept that. So the issue doesn't seem to be resolved at this point. Why is the contract signed without that issue being resolved?
I think that for me the closure to this point was when the RFI 77 was responded to, where we made it clear what the board was expecting. I think on top of that, Project Co's own proposal said they were going to comply with SHTM 0301, and yeah, there wasn't any. When we responded to the RFI, then there wasn't any complaints about what we sent back. It was so. At the time, I think we deemed that it was accepted, and we were moving forward with Project Co going to comply with 0301.
But again, correct me if I'm wrong, is the solution not simply to take this problem and make it reviewable design data? So it's not agreed when the contract's signed?
No, it was agreed insofar it should comply with 0301.
So your understanding is that it complies with 0301, but it's still included as reviewable design data?
Yeah, no, there was a requirement for Project Co to make it compliant with 0301 in the construction phase.
And were NHS Lothian, were they content with that solution to the problem?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
The reason I raise that is if we could look to bundle 10, please, volume 1 at page 283. So bundle 10, volume 1, page 283. See, this is a healthcare associated infection system for controlling risk in the built environment, HEI scribe report from the 19th of November 2014. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, I don't think you were involved in the HEI scribe process, but if you look to page 285, you'll see in terms of the section 2, the consultation, halfway down, David Stilley and Colin McRae were involved in the HEI scribe report. Do you see that?
Yes, yeah.
Do you remember either of those individuals discussing the HAI Scribe report from November 2014 with you?
I don't remember any detail. I was aware the meeting was going ahead, and I was aware that this was one of the issues we had to work through. But yeah, so I don't remember any specific discussion meeting other than it was still an issue, and Wallace Whittle, let's say in January, we're going to present a revised paper on it.
Thank you. Because again, just for completeness and in fairness to you, if you've not been involved, if we look over the page onto page 286, you'll see that the first full entry, 2.2, see that is the ventilation system design. See that?
Yeah.
Is the ventilation system design fit for purpose given the potential for infection spread via ventilation systems? And the box ticked is no. Do you see that?
Yes.
And it says some concern has been raised in relation to a potential issue with ventilation with regard to negative stroke balance pressure in single bed rooms, awaiting drawings and further information to fully understand if there's a risk or issue. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, is the way that is dealt with, that there's the proposal that comes back from Wallace Whittle TUV Sud. And as you've said, that your understanding is that what the board said is there has to be compliance with SHTMO 301, but the issue isn't fully resolved. It's included as reviewable design data at the point of the contract.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. And again, just to make sure that I'm understanding you correctly, this was an issue that you said that had cropped up amongst many other issues. This wasn't having alarm bells ringing on the part of Mott MacDonald that perhaps there had to be a more detailed review or audit of the environmental matrix at this point?
No, not at this point. No, I say we're working collaboratively with NHS Lothian and IHSL at this point, with the understanding that IHSL were going to update the matrix in the construction phase. So yeah, there wasn't any particular alarm bells on that.
I now wish to move on and just ask you some questions about technical risk registers that were produced in the period before the contract was concluded. If we could begin looking within Bundle 10, Volume 1 at page 75, please. So that should be a document, Technical Risks to Close. This one is the 25th of August 2014. Do you see that?
Yes.
Have you seen this type of document before?
Yeah, I think it was myself that suggested we did something we do regularly as we go to financial close to try and manage the risks on any project. So yeah.
So again, technical risks to close is a risk register capturing what you saw at that point in time as the risks to the project.
Yes. But I think this version here. Yeah, so that's it's August 14. Yeah, so it was something. I think there was an earlier spreadsheet version of this that we had, and it was something we shared with NHS Lothian, and we also shared with IHSL so that everyone was aware of what we thought were some of the key risks that needed to be developed as we all headed towards financial close.
So at this point, summer 2014, if we look at the second entry, so it's a category technical item, project code proposals. The issue was project code proposals insufficiently developed to required level for financial close. The risk impact is high. The mitigation measures are comments fed back on the PCP structure, comments fed back on the draft 1 of the PCPs, PCP workshop held setting out the board's expectations, and 4 individual work streams setting out the board's expectations. And then we see the final box, potential further mitigation required post FC, increase the length of the RDD list, focus on specific design risks, fast track the legal review. Do you see that?
Yes.
So did that risk dissipate by the time you got to financial close in February 2015?
I'm not sure if the risk impact changed. I need to check further on. In terms of the general principle of it, that the Yeah, the PCPs, by the time we got to a point where project or IHSL at the time couldn't, there wasn't sufficient time to do another iteration of the PCPs, and therefore that's when we started to explore mitigation measures with NHS Lothian in terms of if they still want to proceed to financial close, then rather than have open-ended project co-proposals, then we're looking at mitigation measures to try and manage that risk.
And is one of those to increase the volume of reviewable design data that would be in the contract?
Yeah, it was more than just increase the volume. It was provide comments in addition to the overarching clause 12 obligations. There was additional comments that we wanted Project Co to address.
By the time financial close was reached, were you concerned about the volume of reviewable design data? Was it more or less than you would have expected on a project of this nature?
It was a lot more than we would normally expect.
Okay. And would that have been a concern to you, just simply the volume of reviewable design data?
Yes, and it was openly discussed with NHS Lothian and IHSL, the concern about this. At the time, it was felt this was something we could manage in the construction phase.
And again, for those of us that don't work in the space, if you've got a lot more reviewable design data than you'd anticipated, what are the potential problems and risks arising from that?
It's ultimately it's lack of clarity for the project code to progress the construction. So there's programme and cost risks.
And what was your understanding? Why was NHS Lothian content to undertake that increased risk of the greater volume of reviewable design data?
I think it's probably better for NHS Lothian to comment, but I can imagine they were at a compromise. There was a lot of pressure to push to get to financial close. The delays in the project, so I can imagine there was pressure, and there was therefore they were open to compromise about how we could get there.
Thank you. Just still within the technical risks to close, page 75, below the entry we had looked at, we'll see again there's a technical category item, project co-proposals, and we'll see lack of review time for the PCP strategy documents, and again that's a high risk. Does that effectively flow on from the risk that we'd looked at above?
Yes.
And just for completeness, if we look on to page 76, please. Look 5 entries up from the bottom, you see a technical design, and then next to the issue being highlighted is agreement on RDS format and content.
Yes.
And that's noted as being a high risk. What had prompted the lack of agreement on RDS format and content? Why is that still a high risk by summer of 2014?
I don't think I think we'd maybe only just received a first draft of the content by that point. And therefore, obviously, I think at that point we were probably looking at a November-ish financial close. We were aware we were fast approaching financial close, and we hadn't agreed the format, never mind the actual content of it.
And then if you look 2 entries down from that, we see technical reviewable design data, and the comment is due to the current status of the PCPs, the RDD list could be extensive. That's listed as a medium risk. Why is that a medium risk rather than a high risk?
There wasn't really a set of criteria for what was high and medium. It must have just been the decision made at the time in terms of the feel of the risk at the time.
And then if we look to the final box on the right hand side, long list of RDD due to further iterations of drawings, etc., to be made, etc. Board required to both resource the requirements for review and understand the rights of comment they have within the review procedure, which is where RDD is reviewed. This should then mitigate risk of project co-claiming changes. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, is this within the risk register highlighting the problem, and then what you talked about is the mitigation to try to address those risks?
Yes.
We then look on to page 79, still within Bundle 10, Volume 1. this is a document called Design Risks to the Board to Financial Close, and the risks assessed as at the 28th of January 2015. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, could you just explain in general terms, what's this document?
So again, it's the same document, just a further iteration of it in terms of what the current risks were as we approach financial close.
Okay. So we see that the first entry, the categories M&E, the items ventilation, the risk impact is high, and the current mitigation measures is described as the single room with ensuite ventilation design shall comply with the parameters set out in SHTM 0301. The design solution should not rely in any way with the opening windows, as these will be opened or closed by patient choice. The critical factor from SHTM 0301 for infection control will be the resultant pressure within the room being balanced with or negative to the corridor. Isolation room ventilation shall comply with SHPN 04 Supplement 1. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then the final positions, TBC to be confirmed. Was that issue resolved, or did it simply get placed as reviewable design data?
Well, it was reviewable design data. I think 28 of the first. That's. I mean, the text there is very similar to the text that was in the response to the RFI. So it feels like these two documents coincided. So that the final position was the RFI was responded to and position confirmed.
If we could look over the page onto page 80, please. Approximately in the middle of the page, you see the box in the far left-hand corner, PCP/RDS, and then there's a reference to environmental matrix beside that. Do you see that?
Yes.
Approximately halfway down the page, the left-hand entry is PCP/RDS. Then there's an entry for environmental matrix. Content of the environmental matrix, which is described as closed. It said board reviewing internally on 1st October 2014, comments to be fed back to IHSL. Given the first risk that we've looked at about the single bedrooms, why was the environmental matrix closed off as a risk?
I think it was to do with getting the first submission of it. So probably saying that we need the first submission of the environmental matrix, and then we've got that, and comments had been fed back. So I suspect that's why it was closed. It was closing off an action as opposed to maybe a risk.
Then if we look on to page 84, please. This is a document called Technical Risks to Financial Close, 30th of January 2015. What's this document, and how does it differ to the one we've just looked at?
I think these were probably more the slightly contractual elements as opposed to the pure design risks.
So if we look, I think it's 5 entries down, we'll see the item being RDD. Do you see that?
Yes.
So the issue is, despite best efforts of the board, more RDD than was expected by the board. Risk to the project, less well-defined proposals, therefore less certainty by the board, lack of design. The mitigation is IHSL pushed very hard to achieve maximum information during PB stage, further developed RDD schedule for the board. Do you see that?
Yes.
So is that effectively recording that despite the best efforts, there's still a large volume of reviewable design data, and that is a risk that has to be flagged to the board before it signs the contract?
Yes.
And then if we look to the entry below that, again, it's RDD. IHSL have indicated there's going to be a significant quantity of RDD release in the early stages of the construction phase. And then if we look to the far box on the right-hand side, the board and MOTS to resource RDD appropriately manage Project Co's rolling programme in accordance with Part 3 of Section 5 of Schedule Part 6. Do you see that?
Yes.
So again, is that simply the flip side of what we've been looking at? That's the problem, and that's the best way to try and mitigate it and manage it?
Yeah, there was extra clauses added to the RDD beyond the, say, typically you just have a list of items to be submitted, but there was four parts added to it, and one of the extra obligations we put on was that we were looking for a 15-day rolling programme, so that we were aware of what information was coming in, and therefore aware of so the team could be set up to try and review that data in the construction phase.
Thank you. I'm finished with that document, and we can put that to one side. And there's really just one further issue that I want to pick up with you at this stage, Mr Greer, and it's really to ask for your observations. You've obviously worked for Mott MacDonald, you're currently working for NHS Lothian. NHS Lothian's position before the inquiry is that there's effectively an error in a spreadsheet, the environmental matrix, which doesn't get spotted, doesn't get picked up throughout the procurement phase and into the point where the contract's signed. Given your experience of the project, do you think there were issues or missed opportunities during the procurement phase that could have resulted in that issue being spotted at an earlier stage?
I think that in terms of, in my statement, I'd used the word anomaly rather than error. And I guess the reason I did that is I'm not a mechanical engineer, and I didn't want to be saying there was an error when I'm not qualified to do so. So there's definitely anomalies between the guidance note 15, between the SHTM 03 requirements and the rooms, the critical care department. So whether that's an error or not, but yeah, so there. Yeah, I think it's probably better for mechanical engineers to say whether there was a missed opportunity or not.
And in terms of your experience as someone who manages projects of this nature, is there anything in terms of reflections you've had about how things just generally could be done in projects of this nature and in a better way to try to mitigate against those types of issues cropping up in the future?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good work already been done since then. The set-up of NHS Scotland Assure has been a good initiative, and the guidance is being developed as well. The guidance is continuing to be developed. I think particularly in terms of SHTM 0301, there's the patients that classify for a critical care area for the enhanced ventilation. That's been clarified in the latest guidance, which wasn't in the previous guidance. So I think there's good work being done already, and I think that guidance point. I think there's also there's got to be more digital solutions that can support that. We mentioned the ADB database, and having that more up to date and having platforms to look at that. I think digitally there's got to be ways ahead which can mitigate the risk going forward.
Thank you. Mr Greer, I don't have any further questions for you at this stage, so thanks for answering my questions, but there may be questions from Lord Brodie or there might be applications from core participants, but thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have questions for you at this stage, Mr Greer, but what we have been doing is to allow the legal representatives in the room 10 or so minutes just to consider whether there's anything that arises. So what we'll do is I'll ask you to be taken back to the witness 10 or so minutes, and then I'll ask you to come back. Either there may be additional questions or a clarification from Mr McGregor, or there may not, but we'll be able to tell you then.
Okay, thank you.
Please stand.
Mr McGregor?
Lord Bray, there's just one point of clarification one of the core participants has asked me to raise, which I'm content to do, but I'm not anticipating any applications, and it's just one point of detail.
Just one point of clarification. Mr Greer, I understand maybe just one question or one point to clarify.
Okay, thank you.
Mr McGregor.
Mr Greer, there's just one point of detail, and it's really just the point about the derogation, I think, that you'd mentioned in your evidence, just to make sure that we're talking about the same document. Could I ask you to have in front of you, please, it's within Bundle 5, the paper apart, at page 3861.
Yes.
So this is from the contract itself, Schedule Part 6. You just take a minute to refresh your memory in terms of this document. Was this what you were referring to as the derogation?
Yes, sorry.
And again, views might differ on this, but what was your understanding of what this document, this derogation, was doing?
My understanding was it was related to the headline clause is Project Co shall provide the works to comply with the environmental matrix, and this was just clarifying that the Project Co had to address the anomalies that had been identified, including the comments. So this is in addition to the overarching board construction requirements, but these were some specific helpful comments to IGSL to address that were included in Part 4 of the RDD schedule.
Thank you, Mr Greer. That's the only point I wanted to pick up with you. So thank you again for answering your questions, my questions today.
Thank you very much, Mr Greer. That is your evidence, and very shortly you'll be free to go. But before leaving, can I just express my thanks for your attendance today, but also your work in preparing what is quite a substantial witness statement. And I appreciate that will have involved time and effort. Thank you for that, and you're now free to go.
Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a enjoyable weekend with the prospect of interest, whether you wish to follow it or not. There's a bank holiday on Monday, and we will sit again at, I think, 9:30 on Tuesday with Miss Goldsmith.
It's Mr Goldsmith and Mr Cantley.
And Mr Cantley. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and have a good weekend.
Please stand.